Chapter 15, Up to the Woods. A few times during the next day, which was Monday, Grover found himself thinking about Nikki as he sat in his desk at school. He wasn't thinking about her in a boy-girl sort of way. The notion of being in love never entered his mind. He was thinking about her in an interesting person sort of way. It wasn't often that he met anybody, especially a girl, who cared about things like dust mites. He was looking forward to showing her his snakes later on, after school. It would be fun to see if she was scared after all. But first, he had to do some hunting. Just before 2 o'clock, he filled in the last answers on his English test, and then staged a highly realistic coughing fit. "Can't breathe. Nurse's office," he gasped, and he staggered, choking, out of the classroom. Then he slipped out a side door and trotted up Fern Street to the path that led into the woods. The forest was his second home. He knew all the trails that threaded up the mountainside. He knew the creeks and the outcroppings of rock and the places where salamanders were likely to be hiding under rotting logs. In the summer, he spent hours up here. Sometimes he scrambled through brush and waded down streams, but other times he just found a good spot and sat still. He had learned that if he sat without moving for a long time, he would see things. Animals would come out from their hiding places and potter around in the open, not realizing he was there. Once, at dusk, on a summer evening, a spotted skunk walked past him, so close he could see the long, curved nails on its front feet. Today, he was after some dinner for his red-belly snake. The milk snake would get the baby mouse, which he was trying to keep alive so that Nikki could watch it be eaten. For the red belly, a few good-sized slugs and maybe a small salamander would do. Actually, he could get these in his own backyard pretty easily, but he wanted to go into the woods. He hadn't been for a while because of homework and bad weather and working on jobs with his father. He missed it. He was aware that people had been talking lately about someone lurking up there, maybe a terrorist planning dark deeds. But Grover wasn't worried about him. He didn't think about him much. Talk about terrorists and war was the sort of talk that just slid off his brain. He was too occupied with his own concerns to pay much attention to it. He started along a steep uphill trail, which would take him, in 15 minutes or so, to a place where a stream rushed between shallow banks. He could get down to the water's edge easily there and find a few of the things that liked living in damp places. He'd brought a plastic jar with him to take them home in. The rhythm of his steps said, "Happy to be here, happy to be here." Rays of sunlight shot between the clouds, making spots of light like polka dots on the ground. On either side, the woods were thick, everything closed in, dense, stickery, twined with vines. Here and there, a bare-twigged mountain ash with red berries like decorations. The whir of bird wings rushed up from bushes as he passed. He was also looking beside the trail, which grew narrower as he climbed higher, for the holes and burrows that an animal might be living in. Holes, rotting logs, sun-warmed rocks, all those were places favored by snakes, and therefore favored by Grover. As he walked, he hummed a little tune, an ambling, careless tune that went with being happy and trotting along and knowing what he was doing. And his eyes scanned the woods and the ground for anything of interest, and his mind traveled off where it usually did, to his plan to join the Arrowhead Wilderness Reptile Expedition this summer. It was perfect for him. Addison Pugh, a famous herpetologist, was leading it, and it was out in Arizona, where he'd never been, and where the snakes would all be different from the ones here. He would have a great time. He would learn a huge amount, and he would meet people who could help him on the way to his career. He had to go. How could something as trivial as $375 stand in the way? It was very inconvenient that his family didn't have any spare money. On the other hand, it had forced him to be creative. He felt pretty confident about the cereal jingle he'd made up, and he'd solved the cryptogram and sent it in quickly. Sweepstakes weren't so promising because winning was just luck, but he'd entered so many of them, at least 50 just in the last few weeks, that he had to win something. It wouldn't take much, just a few small prizes from 3 or 4 different contests, and he'd have enough. All these thoughts swirling through his mind kept him a little observant than he usually was, a little less observant. He was up fairly high on the mountainside now, and the trail turned into more of a dotted line up here, blocked every now and then by overgrown bushes or a fallen tree. This didn't matter to Grover. He climbed over or went around whatever was in the way. He always knew where he was. But it meant he had to watch his feet more, stepping over stuff and being careful not to trip. So at first, he didn't see that something was moving farther up the mountainside, where the trees were denser. The sound of his own footsteps covered up the sound that anyone else's footsteps might have made. A few yards further on, he came to the place where a muddy path led down the stream bank to the place he wanted to go, and there he paused for a second. That was when he heard a distant rustling, the sort of rustling that only something big makes. He froze. Without moving any other part of himself, he turned his head towards where the sound seemed to have come from. The trees and the thick undergrowth beneath them made it impossible to see very far, or at least to see clearly. All he could see was a patch of paleness far off in the distance. It moved, paused, moved again, and disappeared. He stood still for another 3 or 4 minutes, but he heard no more rustling and saw nothing either. So he went on down the stream bank and sat on a rock by the water. Nothing large and pale lived in the woods, as far as he knew. He couldn't think what it could possibly be. Maybe some huge white bird? A stork? But why would there be a stork in the woods? There wouldn't. A ghost? He didn't believe in ghosts. Anyway, a ghost wouldn't make a rustling sound, would it? So maybe the talk about someone lurking up here was worth paying attention to after all. Grover felt a small shiver of fear. Maybe this terrorist was up here just waiting for someone to kidnap. Give me $1 million to fund my terrorist organization, or I'll slice this boy up and scatter him in the pines. Grover put his arms across his knees and hunched down, bending his face toward the water. The stream rushed by, carrying leaves and bits of twig, making the weeds at the water's edge flow sideways. He stayed that way for a while, imagining what he would do if a terrorist stepped suddenly from behind a tree and grabbed him. The best thing would be to have a snake with him at the time, so he could terrify the terrorist with it and startle him into letting go. A venomous snake would be the best. If he didn't happen to have a snake, he'd have to struggle. Too bad he didn't know any karate or any of those other martial arts. He could kick, though. He was strong and agile, and he could bite. He pictured himself twisting like a giant boa constrictor around the terrorist and biting him in the back of the neck. It would be best, though, not to get caught in the first place, so he got busy with what he'd came for. He turned over rocks, dug the toe of his shoe into crumbling logs, lifted up sodden leaf litter, and poked sticks into holes. Before long, he had some nice grubs, a millipede, 5 water snails, 2 good-sized slugs, and a small purplish salamander with gold spots on its back. He put these all in his jar and started down the trail. End of chapter 15. So usually at the end of chapters, I'll kind of catch up with chat and see, if there was any fun conversations while I was reading. Doc Smudge! The alert did that, not me. Listen, we don't dox. We don't dox. But yeah, so the lull. Oh, will it not let me do lulls? Did Twitch change their everything? I guess. Oh. That actually gave me a jump scare. Coco. But yeah, so that laugh is from Tangle Tower Fifi. That's what I was looking for. I've been staring into space. Hey, that means you're vibing, okay? It totally wasn't me. Oh, my nervous giggle for adding you. I think it's the perfect laugh. It's like just awkward enough where it's perfect. I really I love it. I love it. Do you think she still lives there though? I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, I'm gonna. Oh my gosh, I almost drank all of my water. I like to hydrate in between chapters as well. Do you think they still live there? Do you think? Let me know. Let me know. Okay. Let's keep going with chapter 16, The Snake's Dinner. Shortly before 3:30, Nikki set out for Grover's house. She'd seen it from the back, at least a glimpse of it beyond the shed and the fruit trees, but now she saw the front for the first time. It was a one-story yellow house with two battered tricycles standing out in the yard and three saggy steps leading up to a porch. On the porch was a couch covered in green material, worn almost to white on the seat and arms, and on the couch sat a very old woman wearing a red house dress with a zipper up the front and a baggy lavender sweater. As Nikki came up the walk, the old woman peered at her. "You're not from here," she said. "No," said Nikki, "I'm just visiting." The old woman nodded. She was wearing, Nikki noticed, yellow bedroom slippers with ducks on the toes. "I'm looking for Grover," Nikki said. But Grover must have seen her coming. The door opened, and there he was. "You did come," he said. "Amazing." "Got yourself a girlfriend?" the old woman said to Grover. "She isn't my girlfriend, Granny," Grover said. "Just a girl." Inside, the house was dim and crowded. The TV was on. It was the president announcing that only 4 days remained before the deadline he'd set for the Phalanx nations. But no one was paying attention. The living room was full of sagging furniture, and every piece of furniture seemed to have a child climbing on it, or curled up in it, or crawling out from under it. They all stared at Nikki when she came in. "My brothers and sisters," Grover said, waving a hand at them. "How many are there?" Nikki asked, spotting another one toddling up the hall. "6. The twins and 4 more, plus me. I'm the oldest." He led her down a short hall that went right through the house. The walls were covered with photographs, school pictures, wedding pictures, baby pictures, some in frames and some stuck up with thumbtacks. They went out the back door, and Grover led the way across the sloping yard, over the dead grass and brown rain-plastered leaves, between the gnarled trunks of the fruit trees, down to the shed beside the alley. Nikki began to feel nervous. Her stomach clenched. Grover twirled the dial of a combination lock on the latch and opened the shed door. She followed him in. The air had an earthy smell. A few garden tools, mostly broken, hung on hooks on the walls. On a shelf across one wall were the 2 snake tanks, and on another shelf, and on the floor, and on a small table and a chair, were piles and piles of magazines and flattened cereal boxes, soap boxes and cake mix boxes. The whole mess was sprinkled here and there with little bits of bent cardboard. "What's all that?" Nikki asked. "Contests," said Grover. "Sweepstakes, lottery tickets, stuff like that. There's gobs of dollars out there being given away. I enter everything I can find." "Why?" "Because I need money, obviously." He made a "how can you be such a moron" face at her. "I want to go on the Arrowhead Wilderness Reptile Expedition this summer, which costs $375, which I don't have. So I'm going to win it." "People hardly ever win contests," Nikki said. "I don't know anyone who has." "Well, you will pretty soon," Grover said. "Look at this one." He held up a page torn from a magazine. "You write 1 paragraph, no more than 100 words, saying why Armstrong pickles are the best. Want to hear my paragraph?" "Okay," said Nikki. She glanced uneasily at the 2 glass tanks on the shelf, but she didn't see anything inside, only dry leaves. Grover rummaged around on the table and came up with a sheet of binder paper. He read, "Last Sunday night, I was studying for my math test. It was late, and I was tired. My eyes kept closing, so I couldn't see the numbers in my book. I thought, how am I going to pass this test if I can't stay awake? Then inspiration hit me. I needed an Armstrong pickle. I jumped up from my chair and ran to the refrigerator. I pulled one of those big, green, pimply pickles out of the jar. The first cool bite made my brain go zing, and the next day I got an A on the test." Grover looked up, grinning. Only 98 words. Nikki laughed. "It's great," she said. "What do you get if you win?" "You get $500 plus a whole free crate of pickles," said Grover. "There's all kinds of contests. Ones where you think up a slogan, and ones where you make as many words as you can out of some product's name, and ones where you solve a cryptogram, and—" "Have you won any of them yet?" Nikki asked. "Oh yeah," said Grover. "I won 6 free boxes of oat crinklies, and I won a bunch of coupons for rose petal laundry soap. Just no money yet. But that'll come." He turned to the snakes. "All right," he said. "Time to get down to business. First the milk snake. He hasn't eaten for a few weeks." "A few weeks?" "Yep, they don't eat much in the winter. Snakes out in the wild around here crawl all down underground and hardly eat at all till spring. Hey, you know what I saw when I was up in the mountains looking for snake food?" "What?" "I saw that terrorist, the one who broke the restaurant window." "You did? Weren't you scared?" "Nah, he was far away. Big though. Huge. I just caught a glimpse of him." Grover took the top off of one of the tanks. Inside it, the snake stirred, lifting its head and then more and more of itself from the bark and dry leaves that covered it. Rings of black, yellow, and reddish-brown striped its long body. "It doesn't look a bit like milk," Nikki said. "I know it," said Grover, gazing fondly at the snake. "It's called that because people used to find them in their barns and think they'd come to milk the cows." From a small cardboard box next to the snake tank, he took out the tiny mouse he'd shown Nikki before. It was pink and wet-looking, with a tiny head and bulgy bluish eyes, and tiny legs with tiny toes, like fringe at the ends. It was moving slightly in Grover's palm, but it looked limp and weak. "Bye-bye, baby," Grover said. He picked up a long pair of tongs, the kind people used to turn meat on a barbecue grill. His teasing manner was gone now. He moved carefully. All his attention was on what he was doing. He gripped the tiny mouse with the tongs and waved it back and forth before the snake's head. The snake lifted the front half of its body into the air. Its tongue flicked in and out. "I don't know," said Nikki. "Maybe I don't want to watch." But it was too late. The snake struck out and snatched the mouse. It withdrew into the tank and wrapped a coil of itself around the mouse's body to hold it still. And then it opened its mouth extremely wide and began to stuff the mouse's head into it. "They always eat things head first," Grover remarked, "and they have expandable jaws." Nikki froze in horror, but she couldn't take her eyes away. It took only a few seconds for the pink body of the mouse, still wriggling, to disappear down the snake's throat. For a second, a bit of tail hung over the snake's lower jaw. Then the whole mouse was gone. The snake stretched out on the sand again. Behind its head was a mouse-sized bulge. Nikki breathed out. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. She felt ill. "That's horrible," she said. "Not really," said Grover. "It's how the snake lives. If I didn't give him a mouse, he'd catch one by himself." "How can you stand to do it? The poor little mouse." Grover shrugged. "It's nature," he said. "Nature likes the snake just as much as the mouse." "I guess so," Nikki said. "Well, that's it," said Grover. He set down the tongs and put the lid back on the tank. "At least you didn't faint." "I've never fainted," said Nikki. She felt upset, somewhere between sick and angry. "Want to see the red belly eat?" "No, it's too weird." It's not weird at all, Grover retorted. It happens every day, hundreds of times. If you want to see something really weird, go over to Hoyt McCoy's house in the middle of the night. He cracks the sky open. I saw it. Come on, said Nicky. You're making that up. No, I really saw it. A long, skinny line in the sky. He's doing something weird over there. Maybe he's sending signals to enemy nations. Or he opens the sky and aliens and demons ooze through. Grover wiggled his fingers in a creepy oozing way. Nicky just shook her head. With Grover, she didn't know how to tell the difference between truth and kidding. I have to go now, she said. So Grover led her back across the yard and into the house, down the hall among the toddlers, and out onto the front porch, where the grandmother was still sitting on the old couch. Going already? The old woman said. I showed her the milk snake, said Grover. No wonder she's leaving in a hurry. Fed him his dinner, said Grover. It was gruesome, Nicky said. No kidding, said the grandma. She eyed Nicky with interest. You going to introduce me to this young lady? She asked Grover. This is my grandmother, Carrie Hartwell, Grover said to Nicky. We just call her Granny Carrie. He turned to his grandmother. And this is Nicky, he said. Nicky Randolph, said Nicky. My great-grandfather lived here. His name was Arthur Green. Ah, the grandmother said. He was on the side of the angels. Nicky wasn't sure what this meant, but it sounded all right. She said goodbye and walked back out to the street. Her legs felt shaky and her stomach churned. Was it good, she wondered, to feed a baby mouse to a snake? It wasn't good for the mouse, but it was for the snake. Was it evil for Grover to do it? She just didn't know. End of chapter 17. End of 16. I was looking at the next chapter. We just finished chapter 16. Hugh, hello, welcome in. Happy Tuesday. Hello again. You're doing great, Colie. Keep it up. Thank you. I appreciate it. I love reading. I love these cozy reading streams with you guys. I'm still here, just 8, but lurking for a bit. No worries, Car. Do what you gotta do. Enjoy your lurk. Let me see. Alright, just gotta get a quick hydrate in. And then we'll keep reading. I have also thought if I should still, because I'm going to continue doing reading streams even after we finish this book series, but I wasn't sure if I should continue doing them on Twitch and having, like me kind of catch up with chat in between chapters, or if I should just kind of like record it kind of off stream and just upload them to YouTube, because I do upload all my VODs to YouTube. So pretty much every single VOD from when I've started streaming is over on there. So if you're not subscribed to my YouTube, go do it. Go do it. Even my very first Nancy Drew stream is on there. You could record if you want. That's a pretty good thing too. I just thought about that because sometimes, people don't always interact with reading streams. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I've just kind of debated if I wanted to keep doing it that way or how to just kind of, I don't know, do it kind of all in one without pausing and no interruptions. More so like an audiobook, I guess, if that makes sense. So definitely give me some feedback on what you guys think about that, or once this is on YouTube, because I do upload these more often. So if you're seeing this on YouTube or hearing this on YouTube, make sure to comment. Let me know what you think. I learned like last week how to record. It's basically the same as like clicking record on OBS. I do that every time. So it's no different really. It would just basically be reading without interruptions. So it's a choice. I could always try it with one book and see how it goes. But yeah, it's definitely something I've been thinking about. So let me know your thoughts, and we will continue with Chapter 17. So, Chapter 17, Hoyt McCoy's Horrible House. Nikki headed back toward Greenhaven by way of Raven Road. She hadn't really planned to go that way. Her mind was on what she'd just seen in Grover's shed. But when she found herself passing the gravel drive that led back into Hoyt McCoy's overgrown acres, she hesitated. She thought about what Grover had said, that Hoyt McCoy cracked open the sky. Surely that couldn't be true. But whatever he'd seen might have been a sign of wickedness. Mrs. Beeson thought there was something strange about this man, that he was probably a trouble spot, and Nikki had promised to help her. So maybe, while she was here, she should check on Hoyt McCoy. She didn't really want to. Even her strong curiosity didn't extend to creepy isolated houses and people with a whiff of wrongness about them. But if she was going to do her part to root out badness so that goodness could win, she had to be brave. She gritted her teeth and took a deep, shaky breath. She would just dart in and have a quick look around, hoping to see something that would let her take back a clear report to Mrs. Beeson. She started up the driveway. Brown, shriveled blackberry vines grew along the edges. Weeds sprouted up through the gravel. Tall pine trees on the left cast a spiky line of shadows, and Nikki stayed within these shadows as much as she could. She rounded a curve, and there, up ahead, was the house, a mud-colored, two-story building, tucked back among great looming oaks and pines, its paint worn off, drifts of old leaves on its peaked roof. She stopped and looked for signs of movement. 3 birds shot up from a clump of grass, but other than that, she saw nothing stirring, either outside the house or behind its windows. So cautiously, she moved forward again. What was she looking for? She didn't really know. Something truly awful, like freshly dug graves or human bones? Signs of craziness, like Hoyt McCoy dancing around naked? Disgusting filthiness, like a smelly outhouse or rat-swarmed garbage? She didn't see anything like that. Nothing but a dusty black car parked at the head of the drive. Maybe bad things happened inside that dark, silent house, but she certainly wasn't going to go close enough to peer in the windows. She would go up to the beginning of the brick path that led to the front door, she decided, and if she didn't see anything notable by then, she'd leave. So she crept away from the protective shadow of the trees and tiptoed across the open space in front of the house. She stood at the front of the path. Her gaze scanned the front door, the windows to the left and right of the front door heavily curtained, the windows on the second floor, where the blinds were closed, and a window in a gable above them, where she took a sudden step backward and her knees went weak. The barrel of a gun pointed at the sky. And as she stood there, frozen with fear, the gun angled downward until it aimed straight at her. From inside the house, a voice called out, "Stop right there, trespasser, intruder, spy. Don't move, on pain of dire consequences." But Nikki was not going to stand there and get shot. She dashed toward the shadows of the trees as fast as her jelly-like legs would carry her. Any second, she expected to hear a bang and feel the punch of a shot between her shoulder blades. At the edge of the driveway, she stumbled and fell, and she lay there for a second, shaking and looking at the house. The gun was still pointing downward, but no one was shouting. No one was coming out the front door. So she staggered to her feet again. This time her legs worked, and she ran. She knew Crystal wouldn't be home yet, so she ran straight to Mrs. Beeson's house, leapt up the steps, and rang the doorbell. When Mrs. Beeson answered, Nikki was breathing so hard she could hardly speak. "Mrs. Beeson," she gasped, "that McCoy man tried to shoot me." Mrs. Beeson's eyes grew so wide that the whites showed all the way around. "What? Shoot you?" Nikki told about the gun pointing out the window and the voice that had bellowed at her. "Oh," Mrs. Beeson grasped Nikki by the arm and pulled her inside. "This is even worse than I thought. I must get the police. Must get them out there right now. She hurried away down the hall, leaving Nicky quivering by the door. In a moment, Nicky heard her speaking to someone on the phone. Raven Road, she said. Yes. McCoy. Be careful. He has guns. I'll meet you out there. When she came back, she was pulling on her coat. We'll bring him in, she said. Don't worry. You poor, brave little thing. She gave Nicky a quick, sweet-smelling hug. I should have known. That feeling I had. Why didn't I? She clasped her hands and took a deep breath. Slow down, Brenda, she told herself. Be calm. But Nicky wasn't calm at all. She was terribly excited. There's more, she said. The boy with the snakes, he feeds them live baby mice. And that terrorist up in the woods, he saw him. And he told me that Hoyt McCoy cracks the sky open and sends signals to enemy nations. Mrs. Beeson snatched her purse from a table near the door. I have to get out there right away, she said. You go back home now and keep yourself safe. Who knows? He might be... But we'll get him, don't worry. I'll come and talk to you when it's all over. Nicky went back to Green Haven, wishing for once that Crystal was around so she could tell her about what had happened. But the only sign of Crystal was a note she'd left on the hall table by the phone. Nicky, your mom called. Sounded pretty tired and worried. Another postcard came from your dad. It said, Dear Nicky and Rachel, everything here is going well. We're working hard and making good progress. I hope both of you are taking excellent care of yourselves. Love, Dad. P.S. Stayed up till midnight last night reading Shakespeare. I didn't know your dad read Shakespeare. Back by dinner time, C. I didn't know he did either, Nicky thought. There was something odd about these postcards. She needed to think about them. Was he trying to send a message of some kind? He'd always liked codes and puzzles. He'd explained a lot of different ones to Nicky, and they'd had fun working on them together. Could these postcards be in code? She went up to the nursery and laid the 3 postcard messages in a row on the window seat. She studied them for a while, but if they were in code, she couldn't figure it out. So she gave up for the moment and played with Otis for a long time. His happy spirit made her feel better. Everything about him made her feel better, in fact. His damp black nose, the way the wavy hair grew on the top of his head, the 5 little pads on the bottom of his feet, even his doggy smell. They played all their favorite games, and Nicky pondered her father's odd messages, and thoughts of horrible Hoyt McCoy gradually faded from her mind. End of chapter 17. I'm doing Ori through recordings right now. Ooh. Someday I might want to play that game. I know I could get it through the library if I really wanted to. Because it looks really cute. It looks cool. I haven't seen too much of it yet. Too much of it, just in case, I did feel like streaming it or playing it. But it does look cool. Are you liking it? Ooh. So I'm just checking up on some notifications as well while we're in a pause moment. Okay. Cornhole! Welcome in. Happy Tuesday. No way you're live at this time of the time. I know, isn't it weird? I'm like never on stream this late. It's weird. Isn't it weird? But I kind of like it. I don't hate it. But reading streams tend to be shorter most of the time, so it's not going to be a super long stream. I do want to try to get through, let me see, because sometimes, like, these kind of books, it really depends, because, like, chapters can be long, they can be short, but I think I might try to read 2 more chapters tonight, because then we'll be about 2/3 of the way done with the book. But I think reading streams are also perfect for nighttime because it's like a nice cozy way to kind of wind down. Um, and it's also not nighttime for everybody. If you're in a different time zone, it might not be nighttime yet. Who knows? Who knows? But I'm enjoying it. I hope you're enjoying it. And it's a fun kind of different thing. So, I like how these reading streams are just like kind of more pop-up esque, and they kind of happen whenever I can kind of get to them. But they're always cozy, and I can't wait to kind of keep doing them. Um, Maybe the next one I do won't be, maybe it'll be like a standalone book rather than a series book, so it can be um, not necessarily quicker, but that way, if you don't prefer series or if you can't listen to like a bunch of what's it called? Like episodes, I guess, or videos. Maybe that's not your thing. But I think like I'm really enjoying doing these, so I can't wait to do more. Let me get my hydration in. But Cornholio, happy Tuesday. How are you doing? I had a snack earlier too, so that it would hold me over until I had dinner. Oh, Luna has joined me. She's even sleeping while I'm reading. How cute. How cozy. And I have my fuzzy blanket with me. We're just full of coziness, and I love it. So here we go. Chapter 18. What Grover Saw. Something was going on at Hoyt McCoy's. Grover, who was out by the street getting the mail just before dinner time, saw two cars, one of them a police car, streaking down Trillium Street and veering left up Raven Road, and of course he followed to see where they were going. They turned in at Hoyt's driveway. Obviously they weren't just stopping for a friendly visit. They were going fast. Their wheels skidded on the driveway's gravel. Had Hoyt had a heart attack or something? Had he maybe shot himself in the foot with that rifle of his? Maybe he had shot someone else and they were going in to arrest him. Whatever was happening, Grover had to see it. He ran up Hoyt's driveway in the wake of the cars and stepped in among some trees at the side of the drive so he could watch without being seen. Both cars had pulled up in the open space in front of Hoyt's awful-looking house, and from them sprang Yonwood's policeman and Mrs. Brenda Beeson. The cops had taken their guns from their holsters and were pointing them at the front door of the house. The chief, Officer Gurney, roared in his deep chest voice, "Hoyt McCoy, come out with your hands up. We have you surrounded." Actually, they didn't have him surrounded. They were all in the front of the house. But when Gurney said that, a couple of the police scurried around to the back. Mrs. Beeson, in her red baseball cap, stood beside the other two. Her fists were clenched at her sides, her nose slightly wrinkled as if she were sniffing the air, and her eyes fixed like searchlight beams on the front door of the house. In a moment, the door opened. The tall, stooped figure of Hoyt McCoy appeared. He had on a baggy olive-green sweater and black pants, and his shaggy hair stuck together in bunches, as if he hadn't combed it for several weeks. "Hands up, hands up," yelled Officer Gurney, who must have learned his lines, Grover thought, from watching cop shows on TV. But Hoyt did not put his hands up. He came out onto his front step and stared at the crowd in his driveway, as if he thought he must be having a nightmare. Then he raised one hand, but not in surrender. He pointed a finger straight at Officer Gurney. "Off my property," he shouted. "All of you. Out. What do you think you're doing here?" "You're under arrest," yelled Officer Gurney, though he didn't take a step closer to Hoyt. "Attempted murder." At this, Hoyt lowered his arm and smiled. Smiled? Grover crept a little closer to make sure. Yes, he was smiling. A strange look on that long, bloodhound face of his. He smiled and shook his head slowly. He came down his front steps and approached Officer Gurney, apparently not worried that he was about to be shot. Gurney raised his other arm and took hold of his gun with both hands, as if a tank or an enraged rhinoceros were charging at him. "Officer," said Hoyt, "a mistake has been made, and I see the source of it standing just behind you." He nodded at Mrs. Beeson, who didn't move. "For some reason, this lady is determined to hound me. She sends her spies to trespass on my land. Now she accuses me of murder, which is so ludicrous that I can only smile." He smiled again, a thin, grim smile that had no humor in it. Mrs. Beeson stepped forward, and Grover stepped forward too, to hear what she was going to say. It didn't seem to matter if he came out a little from among the trees. No one was paying attention to him. "Attempted murder," Mrs. Beeson said, in a voice that quivered with outrage. "I've always known that you were a bad one, but now we have found you out before you could—" "Attempted murder of whom, madam?" said Hoyt. "A child, a little girl who had strayed onto your land and was perfectly innocently gazing at your dreadful—" "Now wait just a moment, dear lady," Hoyt said. His smile vanished. His face grew dark with anger. "This is really too much. Lately, my estate has been crawling with prowlers. A boy, a girl, and no doubt others I have not spotted." Grover knew who the boy prowler had been, but who was the girl? He didn't know any girls who would even think of setting foot on Hoyt McCoy's land. Hoyt railed on. "Why, a person would like to know. Why? I happen to be intensely busy at the moment, busy with matters of great importance, matters that could alter the world's future and yours, madam, and yet you send spies to pester me." He shook his finger at Mrs. Beeson. "And when I call out at them, when I rightfully demand that they leave the premises, I'm accused of attempted murder? It is quite beyond belief." All this time, the police remained in a half-crouching position, like runners at the start of a race, ready at any second to leap forward and wrestle Hoyt McCoy to the ground. Hoyt didn't seem to be alarmed by this. He glared straight past them and fixed his eyes on Mrs. Beeson. She glared back. "You trained a rifle on a little girl," said Mrs. Beeson in a breathless, furious voice. "A rifle. She saw it, and she saw you lower it to point straight at her. She heard you. You threatened her. You—" Here she seemed to run out of both words and breath. Her face was as red as her cap. Officer Gurney took a bold stride forward. "Come quietly now," he said to Hoyt. "We're taking you in." But an expression of great amusement slowly spread across Hoyt's face. "Ah," he said, ignoring Gurney. "Now I understand. Look up there, ladies and gentlemen." He pointed upward and backward over his shoulder. "There's your murder weapon." Grover looked up. So did the cops, and so did Mrs. Beeson. In a gable window above the second story, the barrel of a rifle pointed at the sky. At least, it looked to Grover like a rifle, although it was bigger than the rifle his father had, and its shape was slightly different. Maybe it was actually a shotgun? That would explain why it was pointed at the sky. Hoyt was using it to shoot birds, when he wasn't shooting trespassers. "That," said Hoyt, "is not a gun. That is a telescope with which I scan the skies." He turned back to glare at Mrs. Beeson again. "And also scan my property for trespassers. I wish to be left alone. But you, Brenda Beeson, send one spy after another. Why? Why? Why cannot a person be left in peace?" It was an interesting moment. Grover held his breath, waiting to hear what Mrs. Beeson and her men would say. Everyone waited. Mrs. Beeson, too, seemed to be waiting, perhaps for a cue from God. Grover could see her face tightening, eyes narrowing, forehead furrowing. Really, he thought, she ought to be relieved. She ought to be saying, "Oh good, no crime has taken place after all. My mistake, very sorry." Instead, she told Officer Gurney to take one of his men and go upstairs to make sure that Hoyt McCoy was telling the truth. "And look around as you go," she added, "in case, there might be—" "Absolutely," said Officer Gurney. "What?" cried Hoyt. You assume you may come barging into my house without a search warrant? It's a matter of security, Officer Gurney said. In times like these, a threat to security changes the rules. Outrageous, said Hoyt. But I won't take the trouble to stop you. You will find nothing in my house that has the faintest whiff of criminality. He went inside with the two men, and they were gone for about 15 minutes. A very boring 15 minutes for Grover, who didn't want to draw attention to himself by walking away. The cold from the ground was seeping up into his feet. Mrs. Beeson got into her car and sat there waiting. She looked cross and huddled, as if she were the suspect about to be taken in. Grover thought this was rather funny. He didn't really favor one side over the other in this dispute. He hadn't enjoyed being yelled at and scared by Hoyt McCoy the day he crossed his property, but he didn't care much for Mrs. Beeson either. These days, she was seeing something wicked everywhere she looked. The police came out of the house, finally, and Hoyt stood on his step with his hands on his hips and watched them triumphantly as they got back into their car. Your timing was excellent, he said. If you'd come by tomorrow, you'd have not have found me here, as I'm about to go away for a few days, on a mission of more importance than you can imagine. You might have tried to interfere with my trip, which would have been a very bad decision. As it is, we've got this little matter out of the way, and I hope I never have the pleasure of your company here again. The men weren't bothering to listen to him. Weirdest place I've ever seen, Grover heard Officer Gurney say before he slammed the car door. Messiest, too. Guy's a nutcase. The cars started up their engines and drove off down the driveway. Hoyt stood where he was, watching until both cars had turned onto Raven Road. Grover waited for him to go back inside, but he kept standing there, and finally Grover realized that Hoyt was looking right at him. I see my trespasser is back, Hoyt said. There was no anger in his tone. I'm leaving, Grover said. I just wanted to see what was going on. Since you're here, said Hoyt, let me tell you something. Uh-oh, thought Grover. Now I get yelled at. But he stood his ground. At least no one was shooting at him. Hoyt came down the steps, stalked over to Grover, and stood right in front of him. There were grease stains on his sweater, Grover noticed, and his pants were unraveling at the cuffs. He smelt like burnt toast. What Lady Brenda doesn't know, Hoyt said, is that she has the wrong information. Heaven is my territory. I know what goes on there. I know what the universe has in store for us. You do? Said Grover. Not being yelled at surprised him so much that he answered as if they were having a normal conversation. As well as anyone, said Hoyt. Well, said Grover, what does the universe have in store? Ceaseless marvels, said Hoyt McCoy. Infinite astonishment. But only for those who care to pay attention. I saw a crack of light over your house, Grover said. Aha, said Hoyt. He narrowed his eyes and looked hard at Grover. Never mind about that, he said. Why? Said Grover. Is it a secret? Hoyt McCoy ignored his question. If you were to simply ring my doorbell like a civilized person, instead of sneaking around my property, I might show you a few things, assuming you were interested. But Grover wasn't nearly interested enough for that. Maybe sometime, he said, but right now I have to go. He moved backward a few steps. Let me tell you one more thing, said Hoyt, raising his voice. You may tell this to your Mrs. Beeson if you like, who likes everything to be neat and clean and normal. I am not particularly neat or clean. I am certainly not what anyone would call normal, but I am as good as anyone else. And very loony, thought Grover. He murmured a few more polite words and made his exit, trotting down the gravel drive and heading home with a great sense of relief. Grover couldn't sleep that night. Thoughts swarmed through his mind. He couldn't shut them off. So he got up, being quiet so he wouldn't wake his brothers. He put his clothes on and went outside. He would take a short, fast walk, just up the hill to Main Street, down a few blocks, and back home. He'd done it before when he couldn't sleep, and it usually helped. He wasn't afraid. There was nothing in Yonwood that could hurt him, unless that terrorist was roaming around town again. And if he was, Grover could watch him from some safe place and see what he was up to and turn him in. The thought was invigorating. Grover started off. He climbed the hill at a rapid pace, breathing in the cold night air, looking up at the stars, wondering why he didn't do this more often. Being out alone at night made him feel free. He went up Trillium Street, around behind the cozy corner, no terrorists there tonight, and down Main Street, where the street lamps were out, as they were all over town. He saw nothing stirring, not a night watchman or an alley cat, or even a spider, until, as he passed the dark windows of the grocery store, he happened to glance up Grackle Street and saw someone about a block away. Whoever it was didn't walk purposefully, but drifted a little this way, a little that way, as if lost or looking for something. Was it a sleepwalker? Grover stopped and stared. He was too far away to be sure who he was seeing, but suddenly he thought he knew. It must be her. It was the right street. Why would she be outside? She seemed to be wearing, what, a nightgown? Something pale and floaty. He started in that direction. But before he'd gone more than a few steps, another figure appeared, a skinny girl, who dashed up behind the lost-looking one, took her arm, and led her back into the house. Grover turned downhill and headed for home. What he'd seen had given him a sad, shaky feeling. Poor Prophet, he thought. It must be awful to have God speak to you and turn your mind into ashes. End of chapter 18. All right. Got my bookmark in place. JB, hello. Happy Tuesday. I keep having to think about what day it is because it does not feel like a Tuesday. JB, how are you doing? I need to get my hydrate in. I feel like my voice is not used to these reading streams, as I kind of had to put a pause because of the holidays and everything. And being sick, I had no voice for a little bit. So now that I have a voice again, I started doing these again. But I think I need to kind of get used to them again because my voice is already starting to like get dry. I can feel it. So I think we'll just do one more chapter, excuse me, for tonight. I'm good, thanks. Just got home from work. Oh my goodness. Wait, didn't you leave like forever ago? How are we doing? Glad you're feeling better. Thank you. Thank you. How was work? I hope it went well. Do you also have a ton of snow? I think we got some sleet today, which I was outside in earlier a little bit. Only for a few minutes, which was good. Traffic is a thing. Oh, okay. I'm like, wait a minute. It seemed like you left from work forever ago. Traffic is indeed a thing. I forget that because when I'm driving, it's not like traffic time. Usually. Cold snap begins tomorrow. No. I think we're getting a warm front tomorrow. And then we're getting cold. It's going to be, at least that's what I've heard. I only look at the weather like one day ahead because I never believe it. I never believe it when it's longer than just one day ahead. You never know. But welcome in. I hope you're enjoying the cozy vibes. I'm going to take one more sip of hydration before we get to the next chapter. Oh my gosh, every time I like think a cough is coming, I try to mute my mic. Okay. Nearly 1 a.m. Should probably sleep. Oh my gosh, cornhole. Cornholio. Enjoy your sleep. Have a great night. Thank you so much for being here and vibing with us. I hope you have the best sleep. We'll catch you next time. Like I said, we're only reading one more chapter for today anyway, so it won't be too much longer. So here we go, chapter 19, Blue Envelopes. Nikki woke on Tuesday morning to the sound of rain roaring on the roof and slashing against the window glass, coming in gusts as the wind blew one way and then another. It was the sort of day when you want to stay inside, make a fire, and sit by it with your cup of hot chocolate. But of course, Nikki had given up hot chocolate, so she drank mint tea that morning instead. She actually felt quite virtuous doing it, because it was so hard. She could tell that her willpower was being exercised, like a muscle. This didn't make her happy exactly. She missed hot chocolate, but it made her feel strong. Could it be that the more things you give up, the stronger you feel? Crystal went out early to talk with Len about plans for the open house. "Meet me at the cafe at 6, she said as she went out the door. "We'll have dinner together, and you can tell me all about your adventures." Otis's outing was very short that morning. He stood on the threshold of the back door and looked doubtfully at the rain. Nikki had to push him outside. Once there, he did his duty in record time and dashed back in. Nikki took him upstairs. The nursery room was especially cozy that morning, with the sky so dark outside and the sound of the rain on the windows, and the pulls of golden light from the lamps. Nikki set Otis up on the window seat and gave him a new bone to chew. She propped up some cushions to lean against, and then she looked around for something to read. Her eyes fell on the books that Amanda had left behind. Why not try one of those? She picked the one with the dark-haired beauty on the cover and opened it at random. In the candlelight, Blaine's eyes glittered like jewels. Clarissa caught her breath as he leaned toward her. What a magnificent man he was! His square jaw, his thick glossy black hair, his wide shoulders, her heart raced. When he reached out and stroked her cheek, she trembled all over. "Blaine," she said, "you must never leave me. I want to be with you always." Nikki raised her eyes to the rain-spattered window. She tried to imagine feeling this way about someone. First she pictured Martin, with his hazel eyes and short red hair. Did she think he was magnificent? Not really. He seemed nice, and he was on the side of goodness, but he didn't make her heart race. She pictured Grover instead. His hair was cute in a floppy sort of way. He was smart and interesting. He had a sense of humor, if you liked that kind of humor. But he was also a bit peculiar. She had no idea if he was on the side of goodness or not. And she certainly wouldn't say he was magnificent. If he stroked her cheek, would her heart race? No. She would think it was weird and creepy. Did she want to be with him always? Definitely not. It was hard to imagine wanting to be with anyone always. There'd be times when you'd wanted to be alone or with someone else. She turned a few pages and read some more. Clarissa fled down the stone steps to the wind-swept beach, her raven tresses flowing out behind her. She scanned the empty sands, and when she saw no sign of Blaine, a great cry of anguish escaped her lips. She could not live without him. She would sooner die. Nikki shut the book. There was no doubt about it. If that was love, she was not in love with Martin or Grover. She could live without either of them perfectly well. She looked out the window, where the rain was still pelting down. At the end of the block, she noticed someone approaching, wearing a wide-brimmed pink rain hat and carrying a canvas tote bag. When the person came closer, she saw who it was. Mrs. Beeson. How perfect. If she ran fast downstairs, she could catch her and ask her what had happened to horrible Hoyt McCoy. She didn't bother to grab an umbrella. She just threw on her jacket and ran out into the rain. Rivers of water streamed through the gutters. All along the street, bare tree branches flailed against house walls and shut tight windows. She ran to meet Mrs. Beeson, who smiled when she saw Nikki coming. "Hi," said Nikki. "I saw you from the window, and I was wondering—" "I was just thinking of you," Mrs. Beeson said. She looked a little frazzled around the edges. Her lipstick was slightly crooked, and her ponytail, beneath the rain hat, was damp and drooping. "You've been such a help. Walk with me if you'd like. I'm delivering a few notices." "Notices?" said Nicky. "Yes, urgent ones. I'm getting a little impatient. Here we have such a miraculous chance to save ourselves, and a few people are about to ruin it for everyone. Such selfishness. I have to make them understand. We have a terrorist in the woods. The crisis gets worse all the time. In 3 days we might face war." Mrs. Beeson shook her head at people's foolishness. "So I've decided it's time to take some drastic action. I've done the downhill ones and most of the uphill. Only one more to go." She drew Nicky in next to her, under the umbrella. Her sugary smell enveloped them both. "What are the notices about?" Nicky asked. But Mrs. Beeson was already on a different subject. "It was just too bad about Hoyt McCoy," she said. "Wasn't it? About your mistake, I mean, honey. But I still feel sure that he has something to hide. Don't you?" Nicky was puzzled. "I don't know what happened with Hoyt McCoy," she said. "That's what I wanted to ask you. Didn't you arrest him? Did I make a mistake?" Mrs. Beeson looked at her in surprise. "You didn't know?" She explained about the police action and the rifle that was really a telescope. "However," she said, "I'm sure we were right essentially. He just reeks of wrongness. I can feel it. And doing this work makes me trust my feelings more every day. It's just a matter of catching him in the act, that's all. But never mind. Here's the last house." Nicky was so stunned by this news about Hoyt McCoy that she could barely breathe. A telescope! And the police had gone out and aimed guns at him. Because of her. They had stopped at a brick house with a collapsing woodshed next to it. Mrs. Beeson opened the mailbox. She reached into the canvas bag and took out a blue envelope. In the upper left corner were the words, "Urgent, from B. Beeson." She put it in the mailbox, and they moved on. Nicky started to ask again what was in the envelopes, but Mrs. Beeson was already talking. "Sometimes I'm sorry this ever happened," she said. "That vision of Althea's, and then the instructions afterward. Some parts of it are very hard. The punishment part, for instance." "Punishment?" said Nicky. Mrs. Beeson turned a corner and headed up Fern Street, walking so quickly that Nicky kept getting left behind. "Yes, for people who just won't cooperate," Mrs. Beeson said. "We can't allow that, can we?" "It would be letting down everyone else in Yonwood." "What's the punishment?" Nicky asked. But Mrs. Beeson might not have heard her over the splash of the rain. "It's such a responsibility," she went on. "I've agonized over it, I must admit. Some of the things she says, I don't know. I hate to think she really means—" She shook her head, staring down at the wet sidewalk. "I just hesitate to—" Then suddenly she stopped, and a little rush of water flowed off the top of her pink hat onto Nicky's head. Her voice became strong again. "What am I saying? I hesitate? Just because something is hard? Just because it means making a sacrifice? No, no, no. That's what faith is, isn't it? Believing even when you don't understand?" Nicky looked up at her. She was gazing at the sky, her eyes shining, paying no attention to the rain falling on her face. "It is?" Nicky said. "Yes," said Mrs. Beeson. "It is." And with that, she hurried away. Back at Greenhaven, Nicky went upstairs, passing some men who were polishing the floors with a roaring machine. Mrs. Beeson, she thought, seemed more fired up than ever, like an engine revved to a higher level. Nicky had the feeling something was going to happen. In the nursery, Otis greeted her energetically. "Odie, Odie, Otis!" she cried. She rolled him over and scratched his pink tummy, and he paddled his feet and stretched his head out so she could scratch his throat, too. "You are a darling, Otis," she said. She lifted him up onto the window seat, and she turned on the lamp. As the rain pounded down outside, she started in again on the stack of papers she'd taken from the big trunk. She found some letters written to Mommy and Daddy from a girl at summer camp in 1955, and an article cut from a newspaper's social pages about an elegant birthday party held at Greenhaven in 1940. After setting aside still more bent postcards and an ancient Christmas card and faded photographs, she came upon a fragile old envelope with a strange-looking letter inside that she thought at first was just a page of crazy scribbling. But when she looked at it closely, she could see that it was writing after all. It was some sort of double writing. The letter writer, someone named Elizabeth, had written on the page in the usual way, then had turned the paper and written right across what she'd written before. The result looked totally unreadable, like two barbed wire fences laid on top of each other. But she found that if she held the paper in a certain way, slightly tipped, the writing going one direction faded into the background, and the writing going the other direction became clear. The letter was dated January 4th, 1919. Most of it wasn't really worth the trouble it took to read. Elizabeth wrote about ordinary things: visitors who'd arrived, a party, new clothes, a new horse. One bit was intriguing, though. I hope your dear mother is not so terribly sad as she was. I see as I write this that it's been a year today since the fever took darling baby Frederick. Such a great sorrow. But time must have healed her a little by now. Nicky imagined the mother, young and beautiful, and wearing one of those long, slender dresses she'd seen in the photographs, sitting in anguish at the bedside of her baby, not able to give him the right medicine because it hadn't been invented yet. It would be dreadful to watch her baby die. No wonder she was still sad a year later. She decided to keep this letter because of the strange way it was written. She set it on the shelf with the picture of the twins. It was time to meet Crystal for dinner. Nicky walked toward downtown. Overhead, she heard the fighter jets again, roaring across the sky above the clouds. She shivered, thinking of the president's deadline. Only 3 days left. The whole town had a gloomy, closed-in look tonight. Nearly all the houses were dark, their blinds and curtains drawn. A small house on Birch Street had lighted windows, though, and as Nicky passed, she saw a police car draw up in front of it. Good, she thought. They're going to make those people follow the rules. When she got to the cozy corner and pushed open the door, warm, food-scented air greeted her. The restaurant was dim because its lights were off, but candles on each table made it seem cozy anyhow. She spotted Crystal right away. She was sitting with her back to Nicky, at a table beside the window, and across from her sat a tall man with a little mustache. It must be Len, the real estate agent. Why was he here? Crystal hadn't said that she was meeting Len for dinner. She'd said she and Nicky would have dinner together, and Nicky would tell her about her adventures. Not that she had any adventures she wanted to tell about. Len saw her standing there. He said something to Crystal, and she turned around and called, "Nicky, here we are." When Nicky sat down, Crystal said, "I talked to your mother today. She got a card from your father. Didn't say where he was or what he was doing, but he said he might have a surprise for her pretty soon." "He must be coming home," Nicky said. "Oh, I hope he is." She missed her father with a terrible ache all of a sudden. He called her his chickadee and made paper airplanes for her. She wished he were here right now. She wanted to ask if her mother had said anything else, but Crystal had moved on to another subject. "We've been planning," she said. "We're thinking this Saturday for the open house." "Crossing our fingers for good weather," said Len, grinning, and holding up 2 sets of crossed fingers and wagging them at Nicky. "That means a lot of work has to get done during the next 3 days," said Crystal. She sounded quite cheerful about it. She took her notebook out of her purse, and she and Len started in on still another to-do list, as if it were the most fun thing in the world. Nicky ordered her soup and stared out the window. The last of the sunlight edged the top of the mountain in gold. Someone in a "Don't Do It" t-shirt walked by, and someone else with a cell phone clapped to her ear. Across the street, a black car pulled into the gas station. Hoyt McCoy got out of it. Just the sight of him made Nicky feel guilty. She watched as he filled up his gas tank, and she was glad when he drove off, heading down the road that led to the highway. Dinner took forever. Crystal's to-do list got longer and longer, and every item had to be discussed in tedious detail. Now and then, Nicky commented on something, but no one paid attention to her. She was just about to say she was going back to Greenhaven when there was a loud tap on the window next to her. Startled, she turned. Outside stood Grover, his eyes round and worried-looking. "Who's that?" said Crystal. "The handyman's son," Nicky said. "I sort of know him." She laughed, thinking he was joking around as usual, but instead of breaking into a smile or a maniac face, Grover shook his head and beckoned to her. His mouth moved, making exaggerated words. "Come out." Nicky's smile froze on her face. What was wrong? She stood up from the table. "I have to go ask him something," she said. And before Crystal and Len could say a word, she dashed out the door and hurried after Grover. End of chapter 19.